So I'd like to start with a question, if the slides would be kind enough to change for me. I'm pressing the laser button. There we go. If I press the right button, then it works. How many people know in what year men or humans first landed on the moon? Anyone? 1969. Does anyone know on what year men last landed on the moon? It's 1972. America went to the moon in 1969, went back 6 times between 1969 and 1972, and has not been back since. For the intervening 52 years, nobody has been to the moon. Nevertheless, in the 1970s, NASA had all sorts of plans about how they were going to progress human space exploration beyond the moon missions, beyond the Apollo program. They had plans for missions to Mars, orbital space stations, wonderful new technologies, supersonic planes, human civilization spreading throughout the solar system, and it was all going to be done by NASA, all done by the government. But none of it ever happened. And at that time, if you watch the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, which this is a screenshot from, there was a lot of science fiction coming out suggesting that by the year 2001, by the 21st century, we would have orbiting space stations. You would board a space plane to take you to the moon on vacation or to go and see your family who live there. But none of this actually managed to happen. Why did it go wrong? Well, the goal of the moon missions, despite what NASA may have said, was not to establish a commercially viable long-term presence on the moon. The goal was to make a point, essentially, about national prestige in the context of the Cold War. The purpose was to beat the Russians, beat the Soviets, to getting to the moon. If you watch President Kennedy's speech from 1961, when he announces the lunar program, you might have heard this. He says, "We choose to go not because it's easy, but because it's hard." Just because it's a challenge, and if we get there first and the Russians don't, then it proves that we're the better country. And the Russians, by the way, won the space race, most of it. From the beginning, they had the first satellite, the first astronaut, the first docking in space, the first extravehicular activities, the first astronaut outside a spacecraft in space. But the Americans poured $301, I think that's right, yeah, $301 billion in today's currency into the lunar program. Every resource was diverted to it and achieved the goal of getting to the moon, but then pretty much arrived there and said, what now? Did a bit of science, and then people started asking, where are we going from here? The money ran out, it was unjustifiably expensive, and it never progressed anywhere. So why is this? Well, there are really 2 different ways that people can deal with each other. On the left here, you have a demonstration. I can use the laser. Well, you have a demonstration of trade, of what we've been talking about today, where people exchange values. I write a book, I create a product, somebody buys it from me. Voluntarily, we exchange. And if I want you to buy from me, I have to do something that's good enough to justify it. I have to make myself worthwhile. So that's one way that people can interact. They can trade. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. They can. How do I go back? There we go. They can trade voluntarily. The other way is through force. So that's the government there demanding its cut of everything it didn't do. And government is essentially an organization of force. Whether or not it's doing its proper job of protecting us or whether it's going beyond that, everything it does is necessarily involves force. And this applies to the question of space exploration and technological development, is that the only reason they could do the lunar program the way they did it, in the very inefficient way they did it, with this giant wasteful rocket and technology that is enormously inefficient in all kinds of ways, was because they could use force to acquire all the money, all the technology they needed, and force through something that would never have happened naturally otherwise. And there are other examples of this if you look at the history of technology. This is Concorde, which from an engineering standpoint is an amazing thing. But I flew here from London a couple days ago, from London to Atlanta. That flight took just over 8 hours. On Concorde, London to New York took 3 hours. Why don't we have that anymore? What happened to it? Well, Concorde was developed by the British and French governments in collaboration. And the point, again, was to prove something about the countries. It was to keep their industries alive, prove that they're just as good as America and Russia, and beat those countries to developing supersonic planes. The result It was basically a rocket in the shape of a plane. This Concorde guzzled fuel to an extortionate degree. It had afterburners on it, so I saw it take off once from London when I was very young. It sounded like a rocket tearing through the sky, which meant that the government then banned it from flying over land, so it wasn't very useful for a lot of routes. But it was so small because of its narrow fuselage and so fuel consuming that the only way that the airlines that bought it could make it work, and the only airlines that bought it were the national airlines of Britain and France, was to make it business class only, super expensive. So you had $14,000 for a ticket on Concorde from London to New York. That was the only way they could make it pay. And eventually even that became impractical and it got withdrawn, and nothing else has been developed since. Nothing like it has been developed since. So this is what happens when the government manages projects. You get something like this, and you don't get the kind of innovation that you might have got otherwise in its place. You don't get the, especially when you have the government passing rules saying no supersonic flight over land just because Concorde's noisy, disincentivizes other companies from trying to develop more effective solutions to speeding up aviation. So eventually, the government space program started to realize this, and they started trying to go in a more commercial direction. After the moon program ended, NASA tried, and the Russians also later, when the Soviet Union fell, tried to commercialize their programs. They tried to create something that would actually attract customers onto their services. And I won't go too much into technical detail because we're short on time, but the Americans created, or NASA created, something called the Space Shuttle, which is basically a giant plane that rides on a rocket into space. And the idea was the Space Shuttle would be somewhat reusable. It's not like the old rockets where you throw them away after every use. It would be somewhat recoverable, reusable. It would bring launch costs down, and it would create more of a commercial system in space. And this is NASA astronaut on the shuttle trying to advertise that concept. Unfortunately, when government is running a program, the people building the technology know that they can charge whatever they like. And something that's quite amusing is that, again, because the government has force, the government can basically get whatever money it needs. And so NASA realized that the companies were doing this. They were just charging crazy prices that they wouldn't charge anyone else because it was a government program. So NASA said, okay, we're going to limit your profits to 5 or 10% of how much you're charging us, of how much it costs you to produce it, sorry. So the companies then just made sure that they did it in the most inefficient way possible so that the 10% was as big as it could possibly be. So the costs just spiraled and spiraled and spiraled. Corners were cut. There were horrific accidents because NASA ignored the fact that reports were saying that the technology was unsafe, that the boosters were going to wear through and explode in flight, and then that happened. And ultimately, the shuttle ended up being far more expensive than it was supposed to be. And it ended up being 7 times higher per launch in terms of cost than it was actually intended to be. So government attempts at creating commercial spaceflight have just unilaterally failed. Like every time they've attempted it, it's gone wrong. Government programs do not create human flourishing. They take technologies that businesses are creating and they make them inefficient. So is there an alternative? Well, after about 40 years of stagnation in spaceflight from the end of the 1960s space race until the early 2000s, there was really no significant progress in spaceflight technology on a sort of Earth-to-Earth orbit level. That's changed completely thanks to Elon Musk and his company SpaceX. And Elon, cheer for Elon there. No, he didn't design the thing himself, but it was his vision that made it possible. His company has created something called the Falcon 9, this wonderful rocket here. And the Falcon 9 is the first truly reusable spacecraft. And SpaceX's goal was to make spaceflight a commercial reality, something that can actually make money for shareholders. And so they created the most efficient launch vehicle they possibly could. Every aspect of this rocket is reusable. No bit of it gets thrown away. It gets reused time and time again. And by doing that, he drove the launch cost down lower than the space shuttle was originally intended to be. So I have the actual numbers here. So in the end, the space shuttle, when you average it out across the whole program, the launch cost was about $1.5 billion for each launch. The Falcon cost $67 million per launch. So it's an enormous difference. It's almost like 20 times cheaper. And the innovations that SpaceX has done in order to make this possible are transformative. They've completely changed how spaceflight is done. So one of the coolest aspects and Pavel, if you can get the video going, is how the boosters return to Earth. So if you watch this video for a moment. If you see the top left picture, that is the side boosters from the Falcon 9 bringing themselves back down to Earth under their own power and landing vertically back on the launch pad. That is a phenomenal feat of engineering. If you've ever tried to balance a chair on one leg, it is very difficult to balance anything on a single point of support. These things use computer technology to stay upright as they're landing. They land back precisely where they were supposed to, and they get recovered and reused. They don't fall into the ocean like the shuttle's boosters did. And this kind of technological innovation was driven by Musk's desire to turn, we've gone further into the video there, turn spaceflight into something that's truly commercially viable. What's funny is that we get to see this happening at the same time that NASA is trying to develop a new spacecraft as well. This is the Artemis, NASA's answer to the Falcon. It's going to cost about $4 billion per launch. It's built out of recycled space shuttle components from the 1970s, theoretically to make it cheaper. But the thing is, government doesn't need to prove itself to shareholders. Government doesn't need to generate a profit, doesn't need to have realistic potential of making money. All it needs to do is convince some senators or congressmen or whatever the equivalent is in other countries to convince them that it's going to create jobs, that it's going to create investment in certain areas. It convinces that, you know, Florida, Houston, Texas, those sorts of places are going to get more jobs out of these programs, that people are going to stay employed in these government projects, that it will bring investment in and shore up the country's national standing. And so the result is this. It's been in development for 20 years. It still hasn't flown anyone to space successfully yet. SpaceX and now Boeing have achieved that in the meantime, but NASA is still standing on the launch pad, quite literally. I also meant to mention that SpaceX has now flown Starship, its next generation launch system. The company's only 20 years old, and it's now developed a reusable space plane that's capable of reaching Mars on its own, has the most powerful rocket ever built underneath it, and wonderfully efficient. Like, unlike the moon rockets from the 1960s, it doesn't have one giant engine that can go wrong. It has 30 little engines inside it, so it can lose engines and still work. It's a wonderful piece of innovation. That's what private spaceflight can create. So why does all of this matter? Why do we care about spaceflight? Well, I did an interview, and this is a screenshot of my interview with a guy called Robert Zubrin, who I'm an enormous fan of his work. He's head of the Mars Society, campaigning for the human exploration of Mars. And he talks a lot about the benefits that spaceflight can bring to human flourishing. And that should really be our goal here, I think, is trying to enhance human life. And he makes a number of points about how Mars can give us new places to settle, new resources to unlock the asteroid belt with all of its minerals and metals and that kind of stuff, but also on a social level. Spaceflight can encourage technological development. In space, technologies can be invented and cures for diseases that can't be done on Earth. But also, Mars and other places, settlement in space gives us the opportunity to innovate socially, to create new ways of structuring society, to experiment with new kinds of civilizations and new kinds of governments. But unfortunately, the government is standing, or the existing governments on Earth are standing in the way of attempts to do that. This thing on the left here, the Outer Space Treaty, is one of my favorite pieces of ridiculous government legislation. It's a treaty between various nations that was signed in the 1960s. It was modeled on the Antarctic Treaty, which was the treaty between governments to prevent any country from claiming Antarctica. And they basically said, we're going to do the same thing for space, like the whole of space. So in a wonderful example of government hubris, this treaty covers the entire universe. And it says that countries or you cannot lay claim to any land, any body, any so, you know, planet on the other side of the galaxy, you can't lay claim to it according to this treaty. And if I can get the exact wording, the exploration and use of outer space shall be carried out for the benefit and in the interests of all countries and shall be the province of all mankind. So you can't claim a bit of Mars and make it your own. You can't use space according to this treaty for military purposes either. So governments can't even do the thing they're supposed to do according to Ayn Rand's conception of government's purpose. They can't protect rights properly in outer space. They can't use military force out there. And they can't and you, according to some interpretations of this treaty, can't go to Mars and set up a new nation, set up a new culture. And that's actually one of the coolest things about spaceflight is it has the potential to let us do that. So Zubrin and the Mars Society wrote this book called Mars City-States, which is all about the different kinds of city-states, like ancient Greek-style city-states, little cities that are their own governments, that we could set up on Mars to get some innovation in government going, to get some competing forms of government going where settlers on Mars can choose which city is the most prosperous, which is the most attractive, which is the freest, and go and settle there. And this book is all about the potential for innovation in ways of running societies, in ways of building cities. But in order to do that, we need rights. We need property rights. We need the recognition that if somebody goes to Mars, somebody like Elon Musk, and Elon Musk has got into arguments with the government about exactly this, that if somebody like him gets to Mars and starts making a bit of the Martian surface useful, the people who do that should have the right to own that land, and I think also to set up new nations in that land, just like the United States did on Earth in the 18th century. My fear is that history will play out again like it did before, that we'll get a similar situation to what happened here in the 18th century, where my country, I'm ashamed to say, tried to run its colonies from a distance, and what does that say? 10, thank you. Tried to run its colonies from a distance, with no idea of what the New World was really about. And if any of you guys are into science fiction, there's a show which I've got a picture from on the bottom right here called The Expanse, based on a series of novels, which deals with exactly this kind of outcome. What if Earth tries to run Mars from a distance? This isn't just across the Atlantic, this is across 20 million miles of open space, and tries to tell the settlers in this new world, literally this new world, how to live their lives. It ends, I won't give away the story, but it ends in a very bloody war. It was actually several really bloody wars in the course of that show, because settlers know how they want to live their lives. Somebody in another country or on another planet doesn't. And is that the picture? I think it is. Yes, it is. And like I said, America is a good blueprint for this, because America was a very different kind of environment for people to live in compared to the old world, compared to Europe. It's a much harsher environment. The weather, the terrain in America is very different. The wildlife is very different. And people settling here in the 17th and 18th centuries had to contend with that harsh environment, and they were on their own, and they were cut off from the traditional economy to a large extent. Ocean crossings were very hazardous and very slow. And they were trying to build a society and build a functioning country in this new hostile land. In order to do that, they had to come up with new technologies. They had to come up with new ways of arranging society. And I think a large part of why America ended up being the birthplace of limited government and freedom, like Dan and others have been talking about, is partly because it attracted the kind of people who wanted to come and live in this environment and conquer it and domesticate it and try and take those risks. And partly because that environment forces you to be rational. It forces you to throw out old ways of doing things, particularly when you go into the real West, out into the desert, and you've got limited resources. You need to know how to sustain human life and how to encourage people to be productive. And for that reason, America, after it became independent, was a hotbed of innovation of new technologies in its new free state. You had new kinds of plows for tilling land more efficiently. You had new kinds of transportation. Britain invented the railways, but then America made them a lot bigger, a lot more effective, and then invented the motor car and the aeroplane. And you had social innovations as well, like the Homestead Act in America, where in the newly acquired territories, people who tilled the land, who made the land useful for producing food, they, after a period of time, owned it because they were effectively using it. And that concept, rather than the government managing the land, letting the people settle it and make it productive themselves, spearheaded a huge increase in productivity. So, by the way, I wrote an article for Fee which talks about Musk and his argument with the government over the use of land on Mars and whether or not that should be for the settlers to use or should remain under the control of the Outer Space Treaty or Earthbound governments. Now, one of the reasons why I think it's important that we have a diversity of nations, like Zubrin is proposing with the Mars city-states, is because the direction that our societies on Earth are going at the moment, like we've been talking about today, which is increasingly away from the protection and recognition of rights, increasingly more towards a 1984, this is from the film version of 1984, kind of society where there's less freedom. If you're moving in that direction, one of the best things you can have is a nation out there or another society out there that's a model for how much better things could be. For people who come from less free countries, I've spoken to people who've escaped from Russia and places like that, the example of the West is proof that something better is possible. And we in the West, with our sort of declining levels of freedom, could really do with a new example of what's actually possible. I think a lot of people have forgotten, or sort of on a cultural level, we've almost forgotten that a truly free society is actually possible. A society where the government doesn't manage everything, where it's not the first answer to every problem, is actually possible, can actually work. We've lost that knowledge almost. And to have new societies that show us that that is possible would be amazing. Unfortunately, all of the Earth's surface now, all of its land surface, is covered by nations that have hugely bloated governments. There is no free country on Earth truly anymore. There are relatively free ones like America and Britain, but there are no truly free countries left. And there's nowhere on Earth to found a new country. Places like Antarctica or the oceans, they're governed by treaties and international law. And their space is also covered by a treaty. But practically, I don't think the Outer Space Treaty is going to work. I think it's going to get tested at some point as we do start to colonize space. And I think it is the best prospect for creating new states that can be an example of what's possible to those nations back on Earth. Now, when America started proving that freedom works, that freedom's possible, because for those who don't know, if you read into the American founding and the arguments that went on between people at the time, a lot of people thought that this experiment in freedom was just a complete mistake and would end in horrible failure. Everyone would riot and it would be a disaster and everyone would go crawling back to the monarchy like 20 years later. And it didn't. It flourished and proved that this model works. And I've lost my train of thought there for a second. Oh yeah, and then that had the effect of showing the rest of the world that if they want to keep up, they have to do that too. So the freedom we enjoy in Europe now is thanks to America. If you compare Europe 200 years ago with Europe now, it's massively freer because it's embraced so much of the American ideas about how society should be run, how governments should be set up. And other places like Japan have done the same thing. They've embraced those ideas, become freer, more prosperous countries. If we can have new economies in space, new societies that can show all of the world that freedom is the only way to be prosperous, the only way for the countries here on Earth to keep pace will be to liberalize as well, to become freer also. And one other point I want to make quickly is that often when you talk about the colonization of space, people will throw all sorts of hurdles against you. They will say that the radiation will make it impossible, or the lack of gravity will make it impossible. Their muscles will atrophy, their livers will shrink, all these sorts of things. And when the railways were invented back in the start of the Victorian period, people thought that if you went over 30 miles an hour, you wouldn't be able to breathe. And every new technology that comes along, people have these ideas that it will kill you in one way or another, it won't work in one way or another. But innovation and productive people will find solutions to those sorts of problems. We will find ways to protect ourselves against radiation, micrometeorites, all the other challenges that space presents. But we'll only do that if companies like SpaceX are leading the way. It won't happen on anything like a reasonable timescale if NASA and people like that are in charge. So this is the kind of future I want. I want this is an example of what's called an O'Neill cylinder. It's just basically a big circular space station that spins in order to create gravity, and you can build Earth-like environments on the inside of that wheel. And this is an idea that's been around since the 50s or the 60s at least. And it's achievable. This kind of habitat, this kind of artificial world could be an opportunity to set up a new, freer society, a new America for the 21st century. But it'll only happen if government steps out the way and lets it happen. So that's the end, and I would like to invite questions. But before I do, I just want to say that I have a couple booklets here which I and other authors have written about spaceflight issues. There's a couple about space, and there's a couple about science fiction as well. And I want to give those to the best questions that I get. So during this question period or afterwards, if anyone has like really cool questions, I'll let you have one of these booklets because I've only got a few of them with me. And that'll be a nice little incentive. So thank you very much.